This episode is brought to you by Battlefield 6. Battlefield 6 is the ultimate all-out warfare experience. Rip through the skies in aerial dogfights. Demolish your surroundings for a strategic advantage. Harness complete control over every action and movement using the kinesthetic combat system. Drop into multiplayer with your squad, or fight furiously as a member of the Dagger 1-3 squad in a gritty, adrenaline-fueled single-player campaign where you'll defend a world on the edge of collapse.
Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Finished training for the day? Time to fight post-workout fatigue with Core Power Protein Shakes. They're packed with 26 grams of high-quality protein to build muscle and electrolytes to help hydrate. The nutrition you need to help your body replenish, rebuild, and repair post-workout so you can power on to the next one. Champion your recovery with Core Power. Visit corepower.com to learn more.
Welcome to this week's episode of Safe Room, a horror video game podcast and proud member of Bloody Disgusting's Bloody FM podcast network. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, and Neil is going to be absent from this week's episode, but have no fear, I have a special guest this week to help me make sense of the madness of this week's game. And this week we'll be discussing Bloober Team's crack at sci-fi survival horror with a long overdue chat on Cronos the New Dawn, such as our calling. Cronos the New Dawn drops the player into the time-bending boots of the mysterious traveler ND-3576, who ventures into a post-apocalyptic Poland plagued by monsters in search of time rifts, allowing them to venture into the past to potentially alter the events of the future. But it isn't just me yapping about Cronos this week, as longtime friend of the show and Bloody Disgusting writer Aaron Boehm joins us once again this week to see if Bloober Team can keep their hot streak alive off the coattails of Silent Hill 2. Aaron, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, you were kind of the de facto guest, I think, based upon our chat, a while ago now about the Silent Hill 2 remake. And we kind of, the three of us during that chat got to sort of revel in the fact that Bloober was able to do seemingly the impossible at not only remaking Silent Hill 2, but really handling that subject matter in a manner that some of their past games did not necessarily indicate they'd be all that capable of.
Yeah, right. This was a really interesting game to check out because it coming a year, a little less than a year after Silent Hill 2, it really felt like this was their game to show off here. That's they really impressed a lot of people with Silent Hill 2, and if they could stick the landing on this, it's kind of gonna keep people interested, I think. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
It definitely felt like they had a marketing blitz for this too, in a way that they kind of realized what the moment was for them. They had the Traveler up on stage at Summer Games Fest in full costume. There were ads everywhere. It seems like they were really trying to step up to the plate with this one after the success of Silent Hill 2.
Yeah, you can feel that momentum, and it definitely shows in the marketing behind the game as well. And I think more importantly, and it's an aspect of what I think works so well with Cronos, is that it feels like a studio that has more confidence now than they've ever had before. Neil and I have chatted in the past about some of their games that we've enjoyed and the aspects of those games that we think really show their talent as a studio, but Cronos, for being this new IP, or being released coming off of Silent Hill 2, it just has this momentum of confidence that I think it really shows when this studio is able to lean into the aspects that are the strongest elements that have more or less been present in their other work, but seeing it all kind of come together into this new sci-fi horror hybrid, I think has been really great to see. And just getting to see that studio kind of get a win outside of having the suppose the acclaim, that something like Silent Hill 2 already
Mhm.
had, it being
Exactly,
on
yeah.
their own sort of like merit, if you will. But I guess in getting right into Chronos, what was your first 2 hours of the game like? Was there like an aspect of the design that hooked you right away, or was there something that took a bit longer to kind of like click with you?
I think this game does a really good job, and maybe this is just like a personal preference thing, but I really like the way the game introduces the world. I think there's
Mm,
so much like there's that right level of vague that's hard to hit, where it's like you give enough tantalizing proper nouns to
mm,
give you some sort of impression of the world without fully giving away everything, without fully explaining everything. And then it kind of lets that mystery, drive you here. Like, what's the collective? What's the change? What are orphans? All these different things. And especially like I really did like the opening where you're kind of doing that like Blade Runner 2049 like calibration type thing. Um, I thought that was really neat, and I think that there's just like a really great level of world building and mystery right out of the gate, that kind of draws you in a way, in a way that felt unique. Even though like this kind of feels like there's a lot of this game, like a lot of Bloober stuff, really takes inspiration from a lot of different things,
yeah.
but it still felt unique and engrossing right off the bat because I didn't really. It kind of like gave you just enough information to get your footing, but not enough to like fully know where you are, and that's important for horror too. Is like having that sense of mystery and anything could happen and weirdness like that. So I really enjoyed the opening of this, and I thought that it kind of grabbed me right off the bat.
Yeah, I was, reading your review, and that was one of the first aspects of your review that really like spoke to me about one of the things that I think is so strong about the presentation and getting the player engrossed in this world is, as you said, utilizing those proper nouns because of the fact that it immerses the player and it gives the player information, but that information is uh, confusing or it's just like kind of
Hmm.
vague and shrouded in mystery, which is a great way to put it because of the fact that you don't want to have too many answers up front naturally because then you're like, okay, well, I'm kind of over this world. And
Hmm.
even once you get past the halfway mark in this game, I still feel like I'm piecing together things because, my understanding of the world and the variables within it, is has more of a foundation, but you still are trying to kind of fully grasp the big picture in terms of
Hmm.
how all of this comes together. And just kind of like letting the player soak in all those proper nouns, the collective, traveler, orphans,
Hmm.
sarcophagus. Um, it kind of just like gives this air of mystery and lore to something that is not spelled out right away. And I think that just kind of like through exploring more and more of the world and getting especially a lot of those naturally documents that you're going to come across and then
Hmm.
seeing people utilize some of the same wording and whatnot, it's like, oh, okay, now I have more context, now I'm getting a better sense of what this world is all about. I guess in terms of those influences for you, like which were the immediate ones other than the big one being Dead Space, which I think has gotten
Yeah.
thrown around a good deal, not unjustly so.
Yeah, for sure. It really knocks you over the head with Dead Space right away with just the iconography of the traveler herself.
Mm,
Kind of has that very Dead Space almost had that like medieval knight feeling to its
mm,
armor in some ways, like a techno knight type thing, and you kind of have that full suit, no face type thing that kind of again gives this like air of mystery, this like combination of like weird impersonalness with that you're slowly peeling back as you go because the traveler herself is very like um cold, especially at the
mm,
beginning. And I think and then not showing your face is a very cool choice there. But yeah, of course the dead space is right there. Like I said, I got a little bit of like Blade Runner with that baseline test at the
mm.
beginning where you're doing like this calibration. Um, and then it really feels like the 12 monkeys type thing. Like it
Yeah.
really hit me with like 12. Like I loved even though you have this like kind of iconography that looks very dead spacey,
Mm,
with the way she looks and the way you have like this cool ass weapon. There's something about taking that level of technology and like just kind of like pasting it over like an urban setting. And
yeah.
it feels very like incongruous in like a good way. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Like it's like you have just like these burnt out buildings, and then suddenly there's just like a room with a bunch of like weird retro future tech, or you have the like, again, you have the same burnt out apartment, and then it's suddenly covered in flesh walls and stuff like that. The juxtaposition of that just does, like, these are things we've seen before. But usually when you have something that is sci-fi or in the horror setting, you're almost always in space. You know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
space is so associated with sci-fi horror, whether it be Dead Space or like System Shock or something like that. So to have it in like a grounded urban setting that not only is, a real place, but like also is in the past too. Like,
Mm.
it's like 80s Poland or whatever that we're working with.
Yeah.
It just felt so much more unique. Like again, like, these are just like they're taking parts of different things and combining them in ways that kind of synthesize into something new. Um, and I think that's really neat. And again, like, they're a studio from Poland, so it's cool to see them bring their own cultural context into it,
Mm.
in a way that is, refreshing to see as somebody who doesn't know anything about Poland. It's kind of
Right.
cool to see this and that sort of stuff. So yeah, those are the kind of things that really stood out to me, the way it kind of mix these different influences from either games or film as well. Like there's,
Yeah.
like I said, that 12 Monkeys, the thing
Mhm.
with all the, like, the way the monsters kind of mutate and that sort of stuff. Um, those are the things that stood out to me most as far as influences.
Yeah, that rugged old school future tech aesthetic, I think, is for me one of the coolest aspects about this, right?
Yeah,
Because it's
I
the
love that stuff.
it's the approach to the future that, Neil and I have talked about in the past. Of what we love so much about it is that it's reminiscent of Alien, right? Which is like
Hmm.
a period that's in the future that is over the glitz and glam of this idealized nature of, like, whether it's space travel or whether it's just future tech in general. And this is much more grounded in that, oppressive, sort of like brutalist, I suppose,
Yeah.
aspect from the 80s, right? Which is, clearly present in a lot of, 80s Polish architecture. And so to
Hmm.
see this tech that is this sort of 70s, 80s idea of what the future would look like, um, devoid of all of that sort of like polish that people have nowadays when you talk about tech. That not only like visually, from a visual standpoint, is like very appealing, but it is imperative, I think, to like the thematics of this game's narrative and story, right? This notion of basically traversing the urban detritus of, a pandemic and whatnot, and you learn
Hmm.
about all of this disturbing things that happen as obviously a byproduct of that, but even the more like subtle aspects of the narrative that are quite dark, seeing this governmental overreach or military overreach. And it's like, how does a military want to handle pandemic? It's like, let's
Hmm.
just murder everybody, right? So there's this aspect that I think the world, visually speaking, is reflective of those thematics in ways that makes for a game that is quite bleak, but at the same time, I think is quite gorgeous. If we kind of want to
Yeah.
transition into just the overall look of the game, like this, it's like an oversimplification, but like Kronos just looks so fucking cool the
Yes.
majority of the time. Like you are going to be going through a lot of these kind of just like burnt out apartment complexes, but this game has so many of these moments of like phantasmagoric sort of visuals, and then you get these really cool vistas of, whether it's burnt out buildings or if it's just, this like astral plane that you'll be exploring. Like Argento Mars Red is like one of the de facto
Hmm.
color palettes of this, that I think just like makes this game look so gorgeous in so many of its like cutscenes and landscapes.
Yeah, and I think like all those like cool landscapes are, it's very technically proficient as far as like, it just looks really nice, like as far as like raw graphics power, it looks really sharp, but it does have like a good sense of art direction too. It knows when
Mhm.
to, it knows what good machines look like. It knows how to make that like sort of like flesh wall thing that we've seen a million times everywhere still look kind of scary and
Mm.
weird. um and I really liked it. I had this kind of, as I started it, I had this kind of like internal battle that I didn't really like some of the there was I was at the beginning, I thought there was maybe one too many like gimmicks in this game, where like
Mm.
as you progress, there's this thing where, like, because of all the like time travel, like there's things are breaking down, and like you have these like places where they're kind of caught between two states, like you have like a lot of stuff floating, and then you use a little
Mm.
tool to like rewind it backwards. And at the beginning I was kind of like, I don't know if that really fits in here. It feels like it's a little too much for the setting. Like it feels like we've already got this like time travel, we've got this like pandemic thing, we've got these weird monsters. I was like, do we need this like weird reality breaking down thing? But I think that actually was responsible for making a lot of really cool vistas, like you said.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of like really like that kind of iconic shot of the building like being like sliced and like frozen
Mhm.
while it's being like blasted in half is like super cool. And I think there was a demo of this maybe, and I think that seems like a perfect place for it to end, because that's like where it kind of like
Yeah.
pulls back and like you get the title card and stuff like that.
Mhm.
um yeah, like it was able to create some really cool vistas by like adding that little twist about like sort of this like almost breakdown of reality and physics and time and that sort of thing. And I ended that part of it ended up growing on me as it went on, as they were found cooler ways to like make that look interesting, like going up through an apartment building and like half the places are like floating around and stuff like that.
Mhm.
I think that was again another like one more twist on like things we've seen before, but like combined in a cool new way.
Yeah, I guess not to get too far ahead of myself, but
Mhm.
generally speaking, like this is an aspect of Chronos the New Dawn that I think is in the initial hours, like maybe in the first 2 to 3 hours, I kind of felt like, well, this is a game that does a lot of cool things, but I've seen all of this
Mhm.
right? And
Yep.
that's been some of the criticism that I've seen from some people or heard from some people about the game, which it's like, yeah, the first, it's kind of not clicking with me the way that I want it to early on. But to your point, like this game has such a smart art direction to it
Mhm.
that it really understands how to utilize those things. And I think generally speaking, like there is a wherewithal to make all of this just like build upon itself to the point when you get to the very end of the game, you have something that is at least like it's going out of its way to do familiar things in the most interesting means possible for those types of mechanics. I think even something
Mhm.
along the lines of like later on in the game, you get those gravity boots, right? And it's like, yeah,
Yep.
okay. It's like the gravity leaping from Dead Space. But again, thinking about the world architecture, thinking about the manipulation of
Mhm.
space, like those sections, I think, are portrayed at least in a really interesting way because
Mhm.
of the architecture, because of the environment. So, yeah, I'm doing something that I've done previously, but this is the most like visually stimulating, sort of like engrossing from a world building standpoint way that I've done these things. And, utilizing that ability to like phase shift stones and debris and things to like make ramps, like seeing that transition from an environmental traversal to having a facet of combat, it's not that
Mhm.
complicated. It's rebuilding exploding barrels, but like it's just again like taking these familiar concepts and incorporating them in ways that are just another tool for the player, which
Y-
who doesn't like to have these have options, whether it's in traversal or combat.
Yeah, I did. That small note you had about the exploding barrels, I found that really fun because
Yeah.
it was like a thing that made me feel smart every time I did it. You know what I mean? Like I know
Mm-hmm.
it's like it's put there for you to do it, obviously, but it was like every time I was like, ho ho ho, I got this guy. I already blew him up with this once, but I'm gonna get him with it again. It's just like, it felt really cool to be able to do that. That was a good little wrinkle with that rewind mechanic. Yeah, I really enjoyed that.
I mean, that feature too, come when you talk about, the survival aspect of the survival horror game, when are running out of bullets, being able to rely on that in those bigger boss fight
Yep.
encounters, like that's a thing that is incredibly useful.
Mhm.
So like it has a functional standpoint other than just like, yeah, you get this one kind of big boom. You get to actually, have that as a safety net essentially. And I think even, you get to a certain point and the traveler doesn't take explosive or fire damage from themselves, like things that they
Mhm.
trigger. So like that furthermore um, allows you to kind of like play around with the tool set at your disposal. Cause as we'll get into later, like combat has some quite difficult sections in it, but
Mhm.
yeah, I guess to build upon a little bit this notion of like a game that does a lot of things that are cool, but they're familiar. For you, like which aspect of, let's say, its approach to combat stood out to you the most? Because that's one of those aspects of the game that I've seen people be like, well, it's just like Dead Space, but in actuality, I don't know how much I actually end up agreeing with that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think just looking at it, it seems very much like Dead Space. You got you're pretty tight on ammo. You're shooting monsters that are big weird flesh mutants. It seems very much like Dead Space, but there are so many small. There's like I would say two elements of it that really made it like go from like, yeah, it's just Dead Space to like it's something else that feels a little bit more tactical and interesting.
Mm.
I really liked the smaller one. I'll mention first because it's probably a smaller talking point, but I really like the charge shot. I
Mm.
know it's such like a small thing, but like having all your weapons have a charge shot felt so tactical. Like every time I was taking a shot, I was like counting like I was like looking, I was like measuring a guy and being like, okay, do I have the time to take a charge shot before he gets in close with me? Am I gonna, you know, I only have 3 bullets left. Do I have to make all of them charge shots? It was very tactical thing that I always had to be thinking about. And the fact that you could charge just made it that much more of a consideration for like your ammo economy because it
Mhm.
like, a charge shot makes that one of those 7 bullets you have left extra effective, and you need every bullet you can, which is like one of my favorite things in survival. Like one of the best things I like in survival horror is like that bullet counting feeling, and I think that forcing you to make those little tactical decisions about charging your shot up really added a lot. And then of course like the gimmick of the game that is like everywhere, the merging mechanic was like
Mhm.
a pretty big consideration. Like the idea that like you kill a guy, their corpse is there, and then another monster can go up to it, stand by it for a couple seconds, and then basically suck up the corpse and become stronger. So it really added like a second, like another layer of thought that like I need to kill this guy, but am I safe killing him here? You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
am I safe killing him now? Should I run around a little bit more and maybe see if I can get these guys a little more separated? Am I going to have to reload after I kill this guy? And in my reloading time, is the other one going to merge with him?
Yeah.
Do I have the fire to burn the corpse? All those sorts of considerations were so cool. And I think it just made the encounters, which, there are a decent amount of enemies, but it's not like there are a million of them. It's not like has like a huge enemy variety. There's a reasonable amount of enemy variety, but just like even when the encounters were kind of pretty samey, like the conditions going into it, whether I had, whether I had flame, some sort of fire weapon, or how much ammo I had left, really made each encounter feel different and tactical and something that I couldn't just walk past without thinking.
Yeah. So I guess I'll work backwards with your
Sure.
points, which I totally agree with, because that. I guess I'll start by saying like I don't find variety is, or the lack thereof in this
Hmm.
game, whether you're talking about the amount of firearms you have or the amount of enemy variants, like variety is not as important, I think, when you have a set number of variables that are more dynamic or
Hmm.
require or have more like strategic implementation than you might be expecting. Like if I do the comparison between Cronos and Dead Space, like they're both survival horror games, but I view Dead Space through more of an action lens now
Hmm.
when thinking about Chronos because of some of the things you said. Like, for starters, the merging here is, again, like this aspect that was present a little bit with Dead Space, right? There was like that one enemy that would come up to corpses
Yeah.
and implant something in them, and then they basically birth a new enemy for you to deal with, a
Hmm.
new necromorph. But here, despite the lack of enemy variety, that is so much more prevalent because of the fact that I think they can all do that. All the enemies can. So it's actually
Hmm.
something that you have to be contending with in every single group encounter, which
Hmm.
again, just kind of like has a bit more momentum to combat. Whereas in Dead Space, you could kind of just like circle strafe and backtrack your way when you have enemies running at you. But here, I feel like as the player don't have that luxury, because if you try to kind of like hang in the background of an environment, well, one of those enemies is going to break off and suck up a corpse and then just become this whole new threat you have to contend with. And I think that they even can have different levels of mergers. If they merge more than once, I think they get even stronger. Like they start to sprout those spikes. It's like there's the smooth enemies and then the spiky enemies and then the ones that can spit acid. And so like there's multitudes to that merging that requires a lot more strategy, I think, on the player's part and how they're going to contend with that, rather than just like, oh, I'll just kind of hang out in the background and pick them off one by one, because the enemies are a bit more tactically aggressive, I suppose, in that manner. And then like you were saying about the ammo economy, like, again, there's not a great deal of weapons in this game, but to your point about the charge shot, that's something that understands the notion of conserving ammunition. And, it gives the player the option of, hey, if you want to be even more strategic and sort of like wait for the enemy to be right in your face sometimes, you could have this payoff that really will allow you to, navigate those fights. It might be by the skin of your teeth, but you can have that extra sort of like one up in combat, if you will. And ultimately, like the utilization of fire with that, napalm ground ability, like that have a facet of combat that stops mergers, but also can be combined with the ability that you get later where you can deal extra damage to enemies that are on fire. But also you can access basically like locked parts of environments that have this, fleshy webbing that spawns over doorways and things like that. So like there really isn't any mechanic of this game that is tied to one facet. It feels like everything is kind of operating in both worlds, whether it's how you get through the world of Cronos or, dealing with combat threats.
Yeah. And I do like that point you made about how it's always interesting when a game has your like combat items also somehow tying into like a traversal utility as well. Like, you do have that, like, I have 2 flame charges but there's probably something behind this door that I really could use. Do I want to use one of my valuable flame charges to see what's behind this webbing to burn it away? I think that stuff is really interesting. I really like that. And I'm curious how Resident Evil 4 is very famous for, its algorithms of how much ammo it gives you, like the way it like kind of keeps you riding that, absolute knife edge of how much ammo you should be having by, dynamically dropping ammo. And I'd be curious how tuned this is, because it feels like they do the same thing in this game. But I always felt so much more desperate in this game. It always felt like I was getting through big arena fights with like 2 shotgun shells left and nothing else, just like by the skin of my teeth. And obviously I died a few times, quite a few times through these, but it still felt like it was doing a good job of riding that edge in a way that made me feel very like desperate a lot of times.
Yeah. And that feeling of riding that edge, a majority of the experience, like that, I think really reinforces the item management in this, which I found is probably more prevalent or more important of a feature than I've found in some other games that, while survival horror, I didn't find that the item management was as important as it is here, because of the fact that, as you said, you're running out of ammo, but also you can craft items on the fly. But you also have a very limited amount of slots in your item, your backpack, for lack of a better word. And I found that the management of that, whether it's from upgrading or whether it's prioritizing items and what you want to bring with you on a given run, like I found that was the meta game that we've seen in other games, but like the gameplay actually reinforces it a lot better, I think, and makes it essential. Whereas, if you think about something like The Last of Us, sure, you're going to be crafting things throughout the game, but it felt like that was a nice addition to your options rather than essential for getting through some of these encounters.
Yeah, for sure. One small thing that's kind of combat related that I really enjoyed is when you got that little attachment to your gun that allowed you to see how much health they still had left. Like it was a little
Yeah.
light that sort of
Mhm.
like you know, and that helped me make some of those decisions for, you know, like should I do a charge shot? It looks like this guy's on orange. Am I gonna take
Yeah.
him out with a one charge shot here, or am I just gonna be using 2 bullets anyway? You know, that kind of thing. But my favorite thing it did with that little gun attachment was when you would go through sections where there were like the fleshy biomass all over the walls,
Mm.
and you could hear them. You could
Mhm.
hear them in the walls, and then you'd use your gun as like a detector.
Yeah.
Like, you know, you'd like hover over a spot and you'd be like, oh, there's one hiding in the wall. And I thought that was really fun, like a really smart way to control pacing. Like, you know,
Mm.
obviously if you just ran through there, you just get shredded. But they give you like a tool with which to, you know, find these enemies before they shoot their tentacles out at you and grab you. And I thought that was a really smart way to control pace using the regular combat mechanics that they were giving you for other reasons too. I thought that was really neat.
No, absolutely. That's one of those tools too that I think it's not so much that we haven't seen something like that before, but it's when you are given that ability
Mhm.
because of the fact that you don't start the game with that. If you start the game with that, you're like, yeah, this is just, of course this makes sense, but
Mhm.
you really, come to appreciate that tool. And I feel like have to rely on it even more the further into the game that you get because of the things that you mentioned, like the lead up to some sections that have a much larger combat encounter tied to them. They might not have as many mobs you have to get through, but they do have those enemies on the wall that will grab you. And then,
Mhm.
you have to bash through them or whatever. But
Mhm.
those are like these little nuisance enemies that, yeah, they're easy to kill. But if you are not sort of like taking the precautions that you
Yeah.
are with that scanner, then all those little interactions end up to a point where you basically are fucked. Uh, if you don't have, the the amount of resources to craft, health items or ammo. So like tools like that are so important, but just as important is when you give those to the player.
Yep.
I will say like that tool in particular, I loved, but there's one or two instances that I encountered where I was walking through, a larger arena style environment that
Mhm.
clearly is typecast. It's kind of like spelling out for the player that, hey, you're going to get jumped here. You see
Mhm.
all these corpses and whatnot,
Sure.
but you scan some of the corpses there and it's unresponsive. And then one
Sure.
of them stands up later. And it's one of those moments where I was just like, I don't love being given a tool that works 90% of the time and then it
Yeah,
doesn't
they
work the
broke the fiction a
10%.
little bit.
Yeah, but I guess those sections were few and far between for it to be
Yeah.
like a major hindrance on combat.
Mhm.
I guess in circling back to combat for you, like how did you feel about the difficulty in terms of, enemies and the difficulty scale in general in combat?
I enjoyed it. I think it's challenging for sure. Like it's definitely a challenge both in actual execution and also in like planning and being tactical, you know, like it's you know, it's about you're being a good precise shot but also making sure you're figuring out when to take your shot and all that sort of stuff. So I think that like it was challenging, for sure, but I felt like it was a good challenge for me. Like it kept me on edge for the game. Like that's the kind of thing. It's really hard when you have a horror game that's really action focused, because like you said, like you consider Dead Space more of an action game than a, you know, survival horror or whatever. But like I feel like this one felt tenser and
Mm.
more scary because of the difficulty level of it. And I know that was something that they really kind of hyped up going into it. They were like, this is going to be a challenging game. So,
Mm.
you know, they were not hiding that. They were not sugarcoating that. They definitely wanted to make something that would challenge the player, and not like in a weird, like shitty get good way, but like in a way that's like, no, we're trying to make like an impressive game that should feel oppressive to play. And I feel like that intensity really helped make the atmosphere work better, which then made, you know, the everything else land even better.
Yeah, I think the 2 to 3 hour window early on for this game is like so crucial in, people really kind of not only grasping the type of experience Kronos is going for, but also mastering all of the fundamentals of it. Like you
Mhm.
can't ignore stuff like crafting in this game because of the fact that early on, maybe I wasn't focused as much on that as I should have been. And then when I started to hit some of these difficulty spikes, when, you go from 3 to 4 enemies, sometimes fighting to, let's say, 6 to 7 or 6 to 8, depending on the waves that you might encounter in some of these arenas, like those are the types of things in gameplay that force players to utilize all the tools at their disposal. And, if you don't, then you're going to be hitting a wall. And so for me, I think that was, a really smart way to kind of like naturally reinforce mechanics and give reminders periodically. And ultimately, like there's going to be sections later on in the game when if you go off the beaten path, there's obviously lots of extra like treasure chests, if you will, rooms that have extra loot in them and these things. And so those are going to be basically like mini dungeons that have, in some instances, like 6 to 10 enemies. Like when you get to the Steelworks, there's one of those off the beaten path sections that you go into it and there's 2 of those massive guys and then there's 5 or 6 of the littler guys. And it's like, oh shit, like I can't contend with all these, but it forces you to play around with the various variables, whether it's utilizing charge shots more, whether it's timing that fire ability, whether it's using that sticky bomb grenade. And I've just found that like it was a game that has a lot of difficulty spikes, but at the end of the day, when you're utilizing the resources that you have, it's all manageable. It's, it might take you a couple tries to get through, but I didn't encounter maybe like the insurpassable difficulties that some people were having on some of those sections.
Yeah, I never got to a point where I was like, fuck this. This is unfair. It always felt like I was like, oh man, if I would have had one more bullet, I could have gotten through this. Like that was usually the point I got where I was just like, I knew I missed. I charged up a shot and the monster, stumbled slightly right as I fired and I missed a headshot or something like that. And that cost me the thing. And I was like, oh man, it was so close. I got it this time. And so that was kind of an important distinction, is that I always felt like, I got it this time, rather than like, fuck this game. It's cheating me. So, I thought it felt right, tuned correctly in that way.
Yeah.
I will ask you this though. I have a question, because I was talking with one of my buddies was playing through the Resident Evil 4 remake for the first time at the same time I was playing Cronos, and he was like, he's not as much a horror guy, and he had recently also played Alan Wake 2, and he was like, I feel like I want a dodge in this game, and I was like, I never really even thought about wanting a dodge. And then I was like, should Cronos have a dodge? And I didn't feel like I was ever missing it, because I felt like it was like meant to be part of the tactical challenge of like spacing and making sure you're moving appropriately. Like it's a very like, heavy feeling combat, and I felt like a dodge would have been like kind of an easy button or something. I don't know. I was just curious about your thoughts on that. I leaned towards, I didn't think it really needed a dodge, but I kind of get what people are saying, or what he was saying about that in particular. But I don't know. I feel like that's kind of part of the fun of it sometimes, is like making sure you're thinking about spacing without having like a quick get out of the way button.
Yeah. I understand within the context of playing like Resident Evil, right? Is Leon Kennedy this like agile guy? It's like, yeah, that makes sense for him. But having a dodge function here, just like very basic, like I feel that kind of betrays the fiction of this game a little bit, right? You're this big, cumbersome, interstellar time bending traveler. You've got this insane suit on. You've got this massive orb helmet that you can't see through. Like it doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense for this character in this world. And, going to the gameplay side of things, I think that, like you said, it again is an aspect that forces players to think more strategically. I think a big part of it too is like, you're able to read enemies' attacks before they happen after a certain while. And at the same time, once you get, 2 hours into the game, you begin to see that like, oh, there's certain aspects of enemies and their attack patterns that delays them for like a brief second, because the enemies hit hard as shit in this game, but that comes at a cost. Like some of the enemies, they'll try to do the slam attack and then they basically get their arms stuck in the ground for a second. That's a moment when you can reposition or take advantage of that and, deal more damage. Or some of the enemies that spit acid will, spit acid and then take a second to wipe their mouth. And that's another moment when you get that in. And, it's not to say like, oh, this is, even though the Dark Souls and Bloodborne games, like they have a dodge button, like those are all games that are about timing. And I think that Cronos has found a really nice middle ground of like, there's no dodging, but you essentially don't need it, because if you plan your movements according to the enemy you're fighting, you essentially have a dodge mechanic, kind of, right? It's like, it's just more strategic and it's not the literal act of dodging. And so, yeah, in a long-winded way of responding to your question, I don't think that this needs a dodge mechanic. And if anything, it would make this game devoid of the tension of combat that I felt throughout the game. Like, I don't think that ever really went away, no matter how big my arsenal got, no matter how well stocked I was. Combat always felt dangerous, and a dodge mechanic would definitely undercut that tension.
Yeah, and I was also actually thinking about it in regards to Silent Hill 2 Remake, because they did have a dodge in there that was fairly effective, but still felt like the combat was intense. So I don't know. Like, I think it felt good in Silent Hill 2 because it was a more melee like, you had a more effective melee option in Silent Hill 2. Like, you have a melee option in Cronos, but you do not really, like, it's not meant to be used. It's like, that is your last ditch. That is if you're out of ammo and you are like, God, I hope this guy dies. God, I feel like I punched a boss to death once, and it was the most desperate thing that I ever felt. Like, I've felt in a long time in a game. Like, I punched it, and then it dropped, and I just let out this huge sigh. So like, this is not a melee focused game, despite the fact that it does have a melee button. So I think it makes more sense for Silent Hill 2, where you have melee weapons and you're meant to be that close and then have this like sort of dance with an enemy. But this one is definitely meant to be done at a range. This is a ranged combat game. Which again, this is, I don't want to say necessarily it's a level up, but like, that's not something Bloober has done before. They definitely have not done this intense of like a shooting game. So it was good to see that they could pull it off. And obviously, they're just finding ways to tweak formulas that exist, and they found the smart ways to do it.
Do you remember which boss that was that you punched to death? Because I did the same exact. I found myself in a similar predicament.
I feel like it was that first boss in the apartment. Like, the one in the apartment where you're kind of like running around between the different rooms, and there's all the like explosives all around, and then you have to like light it on fire, and then you can do the damage to it. I think that was the one.
For me,
and I think I just punched it, and I was just like, die! I ran up and punched it, and it dropped, and I was like, holy shit.
For me, it was the boss. I think it was in the basement. It's like that big tentacle monster that's kind of like crawling on the ground. You have to shoot like these basically glowing sacks on him. But that was one of those boss encounters that was so down to the wire that I had no ammo. I had crafted all my resources. I was literally like egging it on to come at me, and I was punching a barrel while it was on fire and then just swinging on the last explosive sack. And literally, it was one of the most like rewarding moments I'd had this year, because on my, last inch of life, I was able to kill it just by punching it when it was on fire. And it was one of those like sigh, holy shit, I can't believe I did that moment. And then I think, what does the Traveler say? It's never like the typical Space Marine thing of like, fuck you. It's like,
exactly,
the work continues, like that type of a thing, which is the perfect sort of ending to that. But that, I guess, all speaks to like, this game has, I think, like the perfect movement in it, because of what we've been saying about, the capturing the heaviness of the Traveler and the suit and everything, which just sounds like it weighs 1,000,000 pounds, but it doesn't necessarily feel like that, but it's still a little restrictive. But I was thinking about that boss encounter that I had, like the Traveler does have a run option, but it is not that it's not a full sprint, but it's just fast enough that if you time it right, you can get ahead of whatever an enemy's attack is. But it never feels like you can outrun enemies either. So like, it strikes this really nice balance of, if you are aware of your environment and your timing is well enough, then you could maneuver without the need for a dash or, something like that. So that was, one of those things about the general just design of the Traveler that I think feels so good, and it has that weight. So you feel that powerfulness of being in this suit, but at the same time, the game's combat never lets you feel too powerful or too comfortable, because then, we would know what that would mean for the experience. But why don't we take a quick break, and when we come back, we can chat about, the atmosphere and presentation a bit more and dive into some of the narrative of this game. But we'll chat about that and more in a moment. And we're back from our break. And one of the aspects that we talked about a little bit was sort of the overall presentation of the world. Now, one thing that we didn't talk about a whole lot was and we had talked about variety in terms of enemies and whatnot, but in terms of the environments here, because this is, a time traveling story that has you finding these different basically wrinkles in time, and then you can travel back to the 80s and see what it was like either pre-pandemic or post-pandemic and whatnot. For you, how did you feel about the variety of locales that are in Cronos: The New Dawn, whether it was in the past or the present?
I think they were both. I think it was pretty interesting. It's that fun feeling of seeing standard places, city streets, apartments, hospitals, factories, that sort of stuff that are kind of livened up by these weird future tech things, and then also these weird, horrific flesh walls and stuff like that. It felt like a lot of it felt like every time I was getting to the point where I'm kind of done with apartment complex, it would be ready to move on to the next area. I didn't feel like any place I was in there too long. And I feel like that just it kept me moving in the right way and kept me interested visually, going back and forth between new locations that still have the same art style, but have a little bit of variety in them. And I think there was some pretty good there's some pretty good environmental storytelling every once in a while. I think the notes in some areas can be pretty effective, or some of those trips to the past have some kind of interesting little elements as you're seeing these different reflections of the same areas at different times. And then, uncovering what's going on here through notes and set dressing and that sort of stuff. I don't remember all the specifics of it, but I remember there was one place where I went to a house, and there was some little tale about a sculptor that I slowly uncovered as I was going. And then you get to the very end of it, and there's kind of a nice little reveal at the end. And I like finding those little stories like that that's kind of one of the things that I really like in horror games, where you're exploring an area and then learning about what happened there, whether it's through seeing the after effects of it reflected in the environment, and then or finding little notes that kind of exist within the world as letters between people, or diary entries or whatever, that kind of fill in the rest of the narrative. And I think they did a good job with that.
Yeah, I think that these days the games that deal with a pandemic, right, you can kind of almost sometimes roll your eyes at how overused I feel that can be at times, especially the numerous maybe sort of exploitative ways that you could kind of try to cash in on some type of emotional connection or relevance to various things. But here it feels like it's so well done because of the reflection of both the notes that you find, but also the environments. Again, so many of those areas just feel lived in a way that I really liked. It feels like you just missed people that they just left 2 seconds before you walked into the door. But on top of that, there's some really great writing here that is not tied to the overall premise of, the traveler traveling back in time to extract the essence of various people, but it's just people going about their lives. And I think that the scaling of the narrative in that regard is really well done, because you're tracking the pandemic almost, it feels like in real time, basically, the more that you're finding those notes. And it does a good job, I think, of covering all of the different perspectives from the actual act of the pandemic. You're going to read from various community leaders. You're reading different notes left behind from apartment supervisors or military personnel, doctors, but also the individual, just regular everyday people. There's one heartbreaking sequence of notes that you find about, parents that have to separate themselves from their kids because they get sick. And then, one of the parents' notes, it's like the final note, it just says like, I wish they would come through and hug me, but I know they can't. Like, it's fucking devastating to read.
Yeah.
And it's the type of thing that you've probably read something similar in various games, what comes to mind, The Last of Us, but here it's done so in a way that I really was like scouring over every single note so I could find these basically like little heartbreaking vignettes because it's just so immersive into this world. And, I think what you were saying about this sort of like, after a while, it's like, how many more of these burned out apartment complexes am I going to run through? But utilizing that future retro tech is such a smart way of kind of like recycling environments in a way that I think is pretty great for the longevity of this game. It being, whatever it is, like 15 hours or so, give or take. I found that towards the very end of the game, maybe like 2/3 of the way through, I was like, fuck, am I really going to run through another apartment building? But then you use the gravity boots basically to traverse that whole entire section. And it's like, okay, I can get on board with this because it's adding a environmental, almost like kind of puzzle solving, if you will, which is not terribly difficult naturally, but it's just exploring an environment in an untraditional way to what you were doing, 5 hours ago or something along those lines. And I think like getting to view these worlds with one foot in both past and present is also pretty cool from just a narrative standpoint. And at the same time, I think it speaks to like Bloober Team not getting carried away with that mechanic as well. Like you come across some survivors, but it's always brief and it's never the type of thing where you're like actually actively encountering like the soldiers that are murdering everybody or a bunch of civilians. Cause I feel like at that point it would almost take away from the time traveling aspect and like, I don't know, bog it down in things that don't feel as necessary to the overall momentum of the storytelling. So yeah, that was one of those aspects that I think was smart and just like adding more longevity, I guess, to exploring this world.
One thing you said about the, just to circle back a little bit, one thing you said about like, we've had pandemic narratives in the past. Like what I think is interesting about this though, and I know in interviews with Bloober, they said it wasn't really related to this, but it felt so much different to have this narrative after COVID-19, like after we all lived through the COVID-19 pandemic, because there's so many reflections of that within like the capturing the feeling of that. Like you're talking about the thing where it's like, the parent can't hug their kid. And it's like talking about how like, no, it's like, this is what we all went through. Like we all went through this thing where like, we were literally told to stay home and don't be in crowds like that. Like it's a whole virus that's about like, this change that's happening in the world of Cronos is like, if you get too many people together, they're going to merge or whatever. And it's like, that was what we all lived through was like, don't go in crowds and all that sort of stuff. And it's kind of unique. Again, I don't know how they can say this wasn't about it. I don't know if they're just like trying to avoid being quote unquote political or something, but like it feels so like a thing of that time. And it's very strange to me because I feel like there's a weird habit in fiction where I feel like everybody's just ignored it. You know what I mean? Like there's so few pieces of fiction that are coming out now that are actually reflecting upon this thing that we all live through. It's like we all just are like trying to completely forget about it and never actually examine it. Like I just read a book recently called Bat Eater and Other Names for Cora Zhang, and it was like explicitly took place during the pandemic and was about that time and place and that sort of like collective trauma we all went through in a way. And it's just so weird that like sometimes fiction like nowadays seems to just like be like, nah, that never happened, don't worry about it, we're still just trucking along. And it's it makes Cronos read differently now, like it truly feels like a post-pandemic game that is looking at the COVID-19 pandemic and kind of making parallels and that sort of stuff. But not doing it in a like way that's like, hey, doesn't this seem familiar? But like, capturing some of those same things.
It's paying attention, I think, to the aspect that games and films, I suppose, that are made in a post-COVID or I suppose post-pandemic world is that, those types of media that don't handle it as well as they could, it's like it's usually capturing the moments that were the loudest. And I think why it works so well here is that Cronos captures the quieter moments, right? They cover a lot of the, governmental oversight or politicians that are saying you shouldn't worry about this. It's not a big deal. It's just speculation or it's hysteria. Like there's a note early on you find from I think it's a mayor that basically says something along the lines of yeah, don't buy into this hysteria. People have the flu or whatever. And it's yeah, that's a smarter way to have this reflection. It might be on the nose at times maybe, but I think that that's a smarter way to tell a story that has these parallels too, living through the pandemic and whatnot. That's a way that you can do that and it not, again, feel like gratuitous for the sake of it or what have you. And yeah, I think when you have a horror game that has this infection, that is reminiscent of The Thing, this notion of merging and shifting and changing, you can tell a story like that in a way that is just, I don't know, it also focuses on the humanity aspect of it. Because you're going to get to the monsters eventually, but you have to make a world that feels like it actually can facilitate that rather than,
and again, setting it in an urban setting rather than on a spaceship kind of grounds it that much more in our real time and made me think about it so much more while I was playing. Yeah,
I think that it's probably the closest a game has ever gotten to what Doom 2 did, which was bring hell to earth, right? Because like you said, so many horror games that deal with things such as this, or even just horror games in general, it's they don't primarily take place on Earth. So to have a story like this that does, it adds just an extra sinisterness to it that I really, really liked. And I think is quite effective here. Now, I don't know that we necessarily need to dive all the way into the narrative here and whatnot, but generally speaking, how did you feel about, the way in which Cronos handles its time traveling narrative and, dealing with the travelers and the collective and, their mission to, uncover certain things about the past?
Yeah, I thought it, like I said before, I think it was very intriguing. The way they paced out information was very intriguing and had me ooh, what's this about? Ooh, what's this about? Kind of just following all their breadcrumbs exactly as they wanted me to, as I learned more and more about the world and what's going on. I was very into it. I thought it was really intriguing. Combined with the world that you're exploring, I was very into the narrative. I did think the end of it, the last act, I do like it a lot. I think it's a good last act, but I thought it kind of, and I guess it's not bad. It definitely ended up being a more, without getting into spoilers, a more personal tale than grand tale that I thought it was going to be. It kind of felt like we were on some sort of grand mission, and then in the end it kind of ended up being a little bit narrower, kind of about this small group of characters and and their sort of interactions, rather than being about the big overarching everything. And I thought that was interesting, and I do the personal nature. I think there's a really interesting conflict there, is a really interesting setup there in the end. But I do wish there was just a little bit more sense of something about an effect on the whole world, or an effect on the, it feels like you're going out there to solve the whole damn thing, and we don't get anywhere near it by the end, but I did like the personal turn it took at the end. I think it was effective, but it just kind of felt like not what I was set up to do from the beginning, in a way.
Yeah, that was the type of thing where I think just before the finale, it started to lose me just a little bit in terms of I think visually speaking, it's cool once you've been getting all of those essences and seeing how that erupts essentially the traveler and this bridging the gap between the past and the present. And you have all this crazy techno artifacting that pops up, very reminiscent of, oh shit, now I'm going to forget the name of it. Bloober's game that they did with Rutger Hauer, the
Observer.
Observer. There you go. There's a lot of visual elements there that I think are cool, and it's supported by the narrative. But there was something about echoes of the past and the Ghost in the Machine type of a thing that I was a little desensitized to by the end of it. Sure. But I think what I did, the aspect that I really liked was it's a world that's a mystery, and you have these characters that up until a certain point are like very mysterious.
Oh,
But
yeah.
I think that they do a good job of presenting the protagonist in a way that you don't learn a lot about them for a majority of the game, but
Mhm.
and they don't offer a lot up about themselves, but like there's little things about their character that I felt I really started to gravitate towards and had somewhat of a bond
Mhm.
with them, even though, everything is presented with this flat robotic affect.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm curious for you, like the Traveler, before you have any sorts of revelations at the end, how did you find the handling of her character?
Yeah, I actually thought she was really interesting too. That cold robotic thing is not something I'm really used to being in a game. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like there's either you're like a silent protagonist or you're somebody that's, a little bit more personable. And having that cold response and all and like, it did kind of make everything feel a little more ominous at the beginning too. Like, it's, when we're repeating phrases as though we're like brainwashed or something, like
Mm.
all those things, references to like calling and the work and all that sort of stuff. It's just like, it feels like you're some sort of brainwashed robot or something like
Mm.
that. And it's like it grabs you in. And then when you start seeing as she gets these, like, as you start grabbing these essences, these consciousnesses from the past and stuff like that, and you have sort of she starts reacting to them differently, or you start seeing a little bit of personality crack through as she's sort of dealing with these voices in her head or these different things. I think that was made it more intriguing when she would react to them, or how she would react to them, because of how flat and cold she was at the beginning. So I thought I thought she was interesting. And again, like, so much of a character in a video game is down to their visual design, and
Mm.
it's a very cool visual. It's a very cool
Yeah.
visual design.
It's a fantastic looking suit, even if I
Mhm.
do chuckle a little bit sometimes when you get to those little like sliver cracks in a wall and you have
Mhm.
to like inch your way through, and you've got this massive helmet that doesn't look like it should be able to fit through
Sure.
that.
Yeah.
But it is still a very, very cool, like rugged industrial suit
Yeah.
that is actually looks like it's designed for someone to survive a hostile environment.
Right.
So many times these like sleek looking cool um, sci-fi suits, it's like, how is that practical for the hell that they're going through? But this actually kind of like abides by that in a way that I think is, again, just like it speaks to the art direction of this game, which I keep coming back
Mhm.
to. It's just such a strong aspect of its design. But I think also, from a character standpoint, and it's kind of funny that this is where it stems from, but periodically throughout the game, you're going to come across like lots of stray cats, right? That's a
Oh,
huge thing.
yeah.
And those essentially lead you to these little like treasure rooms if you can find your way into them. And they give you basically like a core that basically you can spend on upgrades. But this is also the moment when you get those brief spurts of personality from the
Yeah.
Traveler. Like a couple of the little quotes I loved were, um, you find one of them and you go to pet it, and she says, "Who's an exceptionally handsome specimen?" "Yes, you are." And like there's one where you've collected enough of them, because when you pet a cat, they go back to one of your bases,
Mhm.
and you collect one of them, and it's basically, she says like, "Oh, we're going to need a bigger cat room." Like these little these little goofy lines that at the end of the day, like they show, oh, there is a human underneath this cybernetic shell.
Yeah. I think that the cats were a very smart inclusion, that, like, everybody loves cats.
Yeah.
It's hard to deny that. And it's just nice. It's a very cute thing to use as like a quote unquote collectible in the game, is
Hmm.
like, you collect cats. So it's that was a really nice way to, you know, show some personality for the game, and also as like a studio, like that's kind of a cool thing for them to be like, yeah, and we also want to have cats as a collectible. So I thought that was really cute.
Yeah. And I love that, again, like with this game, I feel that again, like everything circles back to having a function of gameplay, because of the fact
Mhm.
that, you could have just those little cute moments with the cats, but ultimately that facilitates the player investigating an area that otherwise they might
Yep.
not. And quite often there's a combat challenge or environmental puzzle that's associated with that. So it's one of those things that just reinforces the mechanics of the game. Like at one point you find a bolt cutter and you could easily get rid of that bolt cutter and never use it again. But if you hold on to it, you can access a lot of these little treasure troves, but that
Mhm.
comes at the cost of like an item slot. And
Yep.
so I find that it's a game that just like feels indicative of a studio that's grown not only from, the success with Silent Hill and the confidence and the motivation that came from that, or the momentum rather, but they're a studio that is kind of like fundamentally upped their game from every standpoint of presentation, of gameplay, and, for storytelling. I think for aspects of the story, perhaps that I didn't think were like amazing, they still showed that they can tell a complex story that has some, relevance in the real world, which is not a requirement, but I think that it shows their ability to tell complex stories that previous to Silent Hill 2, and, coming off of the medium, I don't think that they necessarily had a lot of sort of goodwill in that regard because of some of the aspects of the medium that were quite off-putting. But this just shows like they're a studio that has earned, I think, the rapport that they deserve with, with gamers, whether it's playing around with a famed IP or whether it's doing something wholly original.
Yeah, I do think, I just wish by the end of it, and like you said, maybe this isn't a requirement. I wish it felt like the story was a little bit more about something by the end, because you have, and I don't know a ton of history about Poland, but there were references to its relationship with a communist government, and both the orphans, the orphans have the monsters are about merging, they're about merging all these bodies into one. And then the collective that you're working for is about like going back in time and trying to take these consciousnesses and like, kind of like merge them into one there. And I was like, you have this theme of, two different ways that are like trying to take a bunch of disparate people and make them into a collective. And then you have this like history with communism in Poland, which, communism is about sort of everyone, being an equal and acting as one and all that sort of stuff. And I just felt like it had these pieces that it felt like it was going to try and say something. And then it was just never really synthesized into like a thesis or something. It never had a thing that it wanted to say about that. It just took those different pieces and did stuff with it. Like, I think some of the stuff about, the pandemic and the way that worked and the way the government responds and all that sort of stuff was very, well observed and that sort of stuff. I just wish there was some, like, we had these pieces of like, the collective and the orphans and these desires to merge in different ways, and these desires to like bring everybody together into like in sort of like quote unquote equal, maybe not an equal society, but like, all being part of one thing, which is kind of, in theory what a communist thing would be about, or like the themes of communism and that sort of stuff. So I just wish it would have found something to say there.
Sure.
That was one of the things that I was, especially with the narrative by the end, I was like, I like the fact that it kind of became like a personal thing, and that worked a little bit for me, but it just had all these little pieces that it never really put together into a message or something. And again, maybe that's fine.
No, I totally agree with you in that regard. It is one of those things where, at the end of the day for me, I have to balance, and I think I've more or less accepted, like I am more interested in a game having a world that I enjoy being in, even if I don't feel like necessarily I've been fully satiated with like the narrative that's been told in that world. That's more or less how I've kind of like navigated games as of late, because of the fact that, I have been let down so many times by the narrative in games. And here it's one of those things that's kind of like, for me, it ended up being pretty I shouldn't say middle of the road. That's not giving it enough credit, but yes, I wished as well that it had kind of like coalesced into something that had a more profound statement behind it, because of the fact that, like you said, it's playing around with this country that, we are not familiar with the history of and whatnot. And that feels like a missed opportunity. I would be interested actually to read some criticism on this, like games criticism on this from someone that is familiar with, Poland's history and whatnot, because perhaps they would have a different take on it, or maybe it resonated with them more. But I think that is something maybe that Bloober should consider for the future, right? If not to say that they shouldn't again tell a story that is, whether it's set in Poland or whether it's trying to be some type of like political allegory in a way. but making it maybe a little bit more accessible to the masses in terms of the statement that they're making. Granted, if they want to have it be a prerequisite for their game or their story to like get the most out of it, that you are familiar with that, that's their prerogative. But that might be, thinking about all of the advancements that they made with this game, it might be something that they can think about for their next endeavor.
Yeah, because I do think about like, smaller game, like for whatever reason I was thinking about Signalis with this too, because Signalis has like some kind of Eastern European influences, with there's like some very heavy German stuff in there, and kind of these themes of like what is consciousness, how do we making some sort of transferring consciousness, that sort of stuff. And I was like, oh, Signalis felt like it was about something in a different way, and maybe that also comes from a place of Signalis was a really small team versus this is like a big team, and it's easier to have two people, like a small set of people distill a message rather than like a big group of people all sort of work together on that sort of thing. So it's like I said, it's not necessarily a prerequisite. It just felt like they had the pieces for it to say something, and then it didn't really have like a big statement or thesis that it had.
Yeah.
In the same way that something like Signalis would.
Yeah. I guess in wrapping up, I want to ask one final question. And that is, as we said early on in the show, Dead Space is the big sort of like comparison point for this game. So in a post Dead Space world and being in a post Callisto Protocol world, I guess, what is something that developers that want to make, whether it's survival horror, whether it's just a horror game, what lesson can they take from Cronos: The New Dawn in making their own game that is, in the world of sci-fi horror?
For me, I think one of the things that I liked about it was they found this gimmick of merging that had both a gameplay element and a narrative element. And I think that is really important. Like the way, obviously, it's not like they're completely linked about it, but like, that gimmick had both a fictional thing that had some sort of relevance, that had some sort of more unique element to it, that they were able to tell cool narratives about this whole merging idea. And then it also had like a tangible gameplay thing that changed the way I was looking at combat. And I think that's one of the most important things you can do, especially in the horror world, where you're really kind of like, the smaller scale helps, or like this kind of like conservation of like ideas helps. And having this one thing that was both relevant to the narrative and the gameplay was really great. And again, like, another thing you can do is like take inspiration, but make it your own in some way, taking inspirations from everything. It's what we all do. It's how art is made,
Yeah.
But having your own little personal thing is important, and like setting it in a setting that is close to them and, means something to them, did help make it feel unique and different from like you were saying about Callisto Protocol. Like if you would have told, like, you could look at a screenshot of Callisto Protocol, and if somebody put a thing under that said Dead Space 4, you'd be like, yeah, sure. But if you put a thing under a shot of Cronos that said Dead Space 4, you'd be like, I don't know, it looks like something different, in a meaningful way. So I think taking the iconography, but like putting it in your own setting, or your own a unique twist on it is really, really important too.
Yeah, I think that's, I suppose, in asking that question and getting your very thorough answer, it's one of those things where it's like that could be true for a majority of, or every type of game. You're going to be drawing inspiration from the things that came before it. Naturally, when they're as whether it's revolutionary or just like the trendsetters, as games such as Dead Space was, and yet you still have to ensure that like your own voice is shining through in some way that provides something that might be inspired by it, might build upon what came before it, but it still needs to be original in some way, whether that's the art direction, whether it is the presentation of the world and whatnot. And I think that ultimately that's what makes Chronos such a successful game for Bloober. The fact that you can have a game that people might try to oversimplify, but when you actually play it, it ends up being an experience that feels quite unique based on, its original voice and just overall, like the presentation of it, art style and presentation is, I think, never been more important in terms of presenting something that might play somewhat familiar, but having the experience at the end of the day settle in a way that feels wholly original and, unique. And so it really just makes me even more excited for what they do next,
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. I'll ask you a question. Are you more excited for their remake of Silent Hill 1 or whatever original idea they do after that? Because I feel like as much as I'd like a remake of Silent Hill, like as much as I liked Silent Hill 2 remake, I feel like this, I think Silent Hill 2 remake is probably a better game, but it's more fun to play this because it's something new. It's like they had something that they are like with Silent Hill 2 that's really good. Like they did a lot of great work with that, but that's really great because it built on something really great. And but like to see them do this where they're taking like inspirations and ideas and that sort of stuff and merging it into something that's their own. This felt more, even if maybe Silent Hill 2 is a better game, this was a little bit more interesting to me to see because I was like, oh, this is them just doing something of their own, So I would kind of be more excited to see their own thing than the Silent Hill 1 remake. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, without question, I'm going to play the Silent Hill remake. And I think for me, as somebody that Silent Hill, as I think of the first 4 games, Silent Hill 1 is the one that I think I've only played once. And, I played it on like the PSP because at the time that was the only way that I could play it, which is clearly not the most ideal way. So like, I'm very excited to get to play Silent Hill all over again, but getting to play it through naturally, the polish and the level of care and hopefully some level of innovation that Bloober applied to the Silent Hill 2 remake naturally. But to say that I'm like dying to play the Silent Hill 1 remake is not accurate because I'm dying to see what Bloober does next, no matter what it is, because of the fact that, they've shown the capacity to, reinvent themselves, I think, but at the same time, like challenge themselves as a studio, which is, for somebody that is a critic and not involved in game dev, like that's something that I am always most excited about with studios is like seeing the innovation and seeing the growth. Not to say I don't have studios that, maybe they don't stray too far from what's worked for them in the past and I still enjoy what they've made. But I think for studios such as this, I want to see how far that momentum can really take them. Because if, Cronos is just the tip of the iceberg, I can't even begin to imagine, what they're going to venture into next. And so that makes it incredibly exciting. I hope it's something completely far removed from sci-fi horror or even survival horror. But I just want to see them continue to kind of like strengthen the aspects of their design and approach to design that, less than 10 years ago, I was not overly enthused or impressed with, and just seeing them kind of like continue to grow, continue to push themselves. I really am excited to see like how far they can take that. And like we said, what comes next.
Awesome.
But that's going to do it for our chat on Cronos: The New Dawn this week. Aaron, thanks so much, man, for coming on and getting to chat with me about this. As always, it's a pleasure getting to have you on and chat about anything horror related, but to get you back here to chat about, a Bloober game, especially post Silent Hill 2, kind of just like further informed our chat and really getting to view this game through its all-encompassing lens of, the studio and, their latest crack at horror.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always a blast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Safe Room. If you enjoy the show, please rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter and Blue Sky at Safe Room Pod for show updates. As always, our main episodes of Safe Room drop every Monday, but our bite-sized episodes of Horror Bites, our indie horror showcase, drop every Thursday. You can follow the Horror Bites Twitter account at horrorbites_SR. You can join our Discord channel, Safe Room Podcast, to chat with us and other horror fans about the genre we all love. And finally, you can send emails to saferoompod@gmail.com if you'd like to share your thoughts on a game we have or are going to cover. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you guys next week.